Hi, I'm Avery, and for my discussion today, I wanted to discuss the concept highlighted in our reading called The Danger of a Regressive Spiral, and this is on page 206, chapter 7 of the textbook that I have. This reading talks about communication differences between American and Japanese communication styles, and I think it perfectly illustrates how bad things can turn when different cultures interact without understanding one another. So the text explains Americans generally favor direct communication, while Japanese culture leans towards a more indirect style. So the conflict that arises here, in my opinion, is that both sides think that they are normal. They don't think that they're in the wrong at all. So an American might look at a Japanese person's indirectness and label it as ambiguous and even confusing, and a Japanese person might view an American's blunt directness as immature or rude. As a result of this cultural blindness, what the reading talks about is that the regressive spiral begins. The reading talks about how an American person can sense that the Japanese person is avoiding the issue in general, so they can become more aggressive and forceful. In reaction to this aggression, a Japanese person can feel embarrassed by the social indiscretion, and they retreat and become more formal and indirect. This story stood out to me mainly because it shows how drastically misunderstandings can escalate a situation. The text shows a timeline, basically using terms to describe how one misunderstanding can lead to another. So, for example, from an American perspective, Japanese workers' ambiguity quickly spirals from being labeled as evasion to being labeled as deception, and finally, dishonesty. And then from a Japanese side of the cultural curtain, as they use in the reading, the American's immaturity spirals into impolite, brash, and finally offensive. I think what fascinated me most about this reading was that both individuals actually think that they're in the right and that they're doing the right thing. Americans think, or this American in the reading, thinks they are trying to solve the problem by being clearer and pushing harder for the person to understand them. But the Japanese person thinks they are managing a tense situation by introducing a more respect or more formality. Neither person is trying to be the villain here, but by blocking communication, they both end up vilifying each other. Clearly, the root of this problem is ethnocentrism, and we talked about that in this course already. But to fix this, I think someone would have to break this spiral. So from the American perspective, instead of pushing harder and becoming more aggressive when meeting that resistance that they feel, I think that the Americans should practice cultural humility, recognizing that Japanese communication relies on reading between the lines. The Americans should have backed off, probably softened their tone a little bit, and allowed for an indirect resolution. However, from the Japanese perspective, I think recognizing that the Americans' directness is a cultural norm for that culture and not a personal immature attack. I think this could have helped them stay more engaged and not cause them to withdraw from the conflict itself. Instead of assuming that the other person was being deceptive or offensive, they should have paused and assumed that the other person simply had a different way of processing the conflict in general. Honestly, my main takeaway from this is that being stubborn in communication and expecting everyone to communicate the way that you communicate, it just causes more problems. It digs you into a hole. Going forward, I think this story would be a reminder for me when I'm communicating with people of a different culture or a different background to be more patient. I think that that's something that this whole conflict was lacking. I think that the Japanese approach was probably better when it comes to different cultures, but also making the assumption that someone is arrogant or rude or immature isn't the right way to go either. I think that it would be very helpful to recognize when an interaction is intense, instead of doubling down on what my style of communication is, to just take the high road. And I think in the end, it will help me humble myself to understand that my communication style isn't going to be everyone's communication style. So, thanks for watching. I look forward to the replies and for us to discuss together. So, thank you.